Good morning, everybody, and welcome to CEBRI. This is another one of our public conferences, and we are also live on Zoom, I believe. And we have here today the busca da interdependência estratégica e o que o Brasil pensa. The quest for strategic interdependence, what does Brazil think? We will be having here 4 PhD professors sitting at our table. And we start with Mr. Pavel Zerka, who's a senior political analyst with the European Council for Foreign Relations. And on the Brazilian side, on CEBRI side, we have Feliciano Guimarães, who is also our academic director. We have Isabel Rocha de Siqueira, who is with director of IRI in PUC, the International Relations Institute. And we also have Ivan Fernandes, also a professor at Universidade Federal do ABC. We will be listening to those 4 presentations on work that was done on a survey since 2010 on how the Brazilian civil society perceives Brazilian foreign policy on certain key issues, and how their position or their views have evolved since 2010 till, I think, 2023 or 2022. Feliciano will explain all that in details. I want to, and of course we will have, after the 4 presentations, a moment for questions and answers. I hope you all enjoy this public conference. And I want again to thank you, the ones who have come here to join us personally, and all our viewers in Zoom. Thank you very much. And I leave the floor to Professor Feliciano Guimarães. Thank you very much.
Hello, I think it's JJ's first from the José Juan from the European Council for Relations. Please.
Muito obrigado, Feliciano. Bom dia a todos. Para mim é um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Vou fazer a apresentação em português porque me sinto carioca de coração. Vocês sabem já que há 6 anos estive na PUC estudando e para mim é como voltar a casa. Então, muito obrigado sempre por ter feito esse evento possível. E eu vou continuar em inglês. So, I'm José Juan. You can call me JJ. I'm Madrid office assistant. I'm also president of the Andalusian Youth Council, which is the region that it's in the south of Spain, the region that have flamenco, tapas, everything that's good, right? For me, it's really a pleasure to be here today with you all. And first, I would like to thank you, every one of you, for coming here. For us, it means a lot. I think we're here for 2 things. First, to listen to you, as Europeans, to listen to you. And second of it all, to articulate hope. Because for us young people, it's really important to articulate hope. And then I'll just elaborate on it a bit more. So I'm here thanks for ECFR, which is our think tank. It's called European Council on Foreign Relations. And what is the ECFR? So we're a think tank based in many European capitals. We have 8 offices. In Madrid, where I come from, Berlin, Paris, Rome, London, Sofia, Warsaw, and we just opened a office in Washington to elaborate more on transatlantic relationships. And why, like, what makes us special? What makes us different? I think that what makes us different in ECFR is that we tend to think on innovative ideas that can be actually done on the European scene. It's not only what we have, it's also about what's coming. And in this sense, I'm sure Pavel will elaborate on it more afterwards. But we want to be here listening to you because we know about the potential that Brazil and EU relations have. If you're thinking, like, in a broader scale, both Brazil and EU, we're more than, like, Latin America and the European Union, we're more than 1 billion people together. And it's just 3 languages. English, that we all do not like, right? And then we have Portuguese and Spanish. This is a huge potential. And not only that, we're also natural partners. Josep Borrell, or the High Representative, said that we should not be only natural partners. We should be preferential partners. We should become partners because we choose to be. We both are democratic countries. We both have this support for human rights, and we both think that human dignity is really important. It's at the core of our systems. And if we look at the world right now, when we have all these problems going on, and we young people feel that we're not nor listened to, and we're kind of hopeless because the multilateral order is at risk, we think that this relationship is super, super important. It's crucial. And we in the Madrid office, Jose Ignacio Torreblanca, the director of the Madrid office, he went recently both to Chile and to Angola to see how we can try and have a more egalitarian relationship. How can we change the multilateral, like the order? How can we make it more fair? How can we change it to forget extractivism? Let's be clear, right? I think North China or the US will transfer technology to Brazil, but I think the European Union can actually do that. We're in that position. And our partnership needs to be stronger, and we need to be clear with this. Like, we young people, we need hope. That's what we're doing here, right? We're listening to you. This is the first part. What does Brazil think? And the second part would be, what can we actually do together? So I really hope this is the start of a really strong and fruitful partnership, and can't wait to be here again in the future. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Johansson. Thank you for your words. I think we have a great panel this morning, and this cooperation between the European Council on Foreign Relations and CEBRI is just starting. I think we have many. It will be an office. Next time you come, we'll be in CEBRI's new office that is just around the corner up here on the avenue. And as you will see on the panel, we have many research and interesting the same between European Council for Relations and CEBRI. And one of the issues that we at CEBRI, but also in our think tank in São Paulo that I also belong to, the CEBRAP, that we've been studying about in the last 10 years, as Ambassador Tony mentioned, is about public opinion and what Brazilians think about foreign policy and international relations, which is something that is similar to the European Council on Foreign Relations has been doing for quite some time. So this is just the beginning of a fruitful cooperation on the issue of public policy, of public opinion in foreign policy. We want to understand better how Europeans perceive Europe and European foreign affairs and the world, and how Brazilians perceive Brazilian foreign affairs and the world. This is something, in the case of Brazil, trying to understand how Brazilians perceive foreign policy is something that is more or less rare. You don't find much in Brazilian academia data on how Brazilians think foreign policy, right? And this whole story started actually the only research center that is focused on studying public opinion and foreign policy in Brazil, which is CEBRI. It's been doing that, as Ambassador Tony mentioned, since 2010. Actually, the whole story started here at CEBRI in 2008. We had a fellow here at CEBRI, Professor Amaury de Souza, and he designed the first sample to ask Brazilians about 50 issues on foreign policy. But Amaury's idea back in 2008, 2009 was to ask not the entire population of Brazil in a national sample, but to ask what he called back then the Brazilian foreign policy elite, which is a group of 300 people that he made a list, and he will call them and ask them about their perception in foreign relations. So eventually Amaury passed the baton to Professor Maria Hermínia Tavares de Almeida, University of São Paulo, and she decided to expand the research. So as a professor at University of São Paulo and a member of CEBRI in São Paulo, we could have access to the São Paulo State Research Fund, which is Brazil's biggest research fund, even bigger than the federal government for research. So then we had an opportunity to start actually expanding the sample from an elite base only to a national sample of 1,500, 1,800 people. So we have been doing these surveys since 2010, which is now we have 6 waves of data from 2010, 2012, 14, 16, 18, 20, 19, 23. Right? More recently, we partnered with 2 other pollsters from São Paulo and in Minas, one from São Paulo, another from Minas, which are very famous in Brazil. Atlas Intel, that runs polls for elections, and also Quest from Minas, who also runs a survey for elections. And we have with these new partners, we have been asking Brazilians what they think of foreign policy. So if you could please just load the presentation, I'm just gonna briefly give you some general idea of what we already know about Brazilians and what they think of foreign policy. What we have shown in the last, I don't think is this one, is the PowerPoint presentation. It's not this one. What Brazilians know about foreign policy in the last 10 years. Is the PowerPoint? Yeah, I think, yeah. One below. I think it's this one. Yeah. In this, because what had been shown before was the full report that we just produced, 2024, and we have approximately some 40 graphs there asking Brazilians about a multitude of issues, right? And based on what Jose Juan said, we don't have much data about how Brazilians perceive Europe, for example. Right? If you probably saw that in the report, right? You say, okay, we want to know about what Brazilians think about Europeans, and we don't have much data there. So in a way, it's a mistake in our sample. We didn't made so many questions about Europe, but also it has to do with we as an academics, and also what we saw from the previous surveys, that we had other questions to make that we thought were more important. So there's some adjustments that need to be made there. And when I'm going to show you some data about the West, how Brazilians perceive what to be part of if Brazilians are or not part of the West, all that is they usually think about the United States and not so much about Europe, although they also think about Europe, right? So you could put, I can run here. So what we know so far, and I'm going to try to be very, very, very fast here, very telegraphic. First, the idea that Brazilians don't know much about foreign policy is completely wrong. The data of the last 10 years have shown otherwise, that Brazilians have a structured and stable opinion about foreign policy. So they might not know much about specific foreign policy issues. For example, if there is a negotiation about Brazil joining the OECD or not, which is very specific, but they have a world view. And based on this world view, the Brazilian people, they have opinions about a number of foreign policy or international relations issues, right? Many of those related directly to the Brazilian foreign policy, right? So this is our studies. Ivan and I have a paper that we published on that. The Brazilians are not different from the rest of the world, because this is what happens in every country that there is some study of public opinion and foreign policy. They've shown in the United States, in many European countries, in Turkey, in China, in Japan, that these people, they know about foreign policy and they have opinions about that. So Brazilians are just as the same. So Brazilians know much, They know so much that in I don't know answer in our surveys are very, very low. So they always have an opinion. One or two issues they don't know much, but they know. No matter if they are affluent Brazilians or well educated, or if they have just elementary school, they have opinion. Even if they are illiterate, that we have 8% of our national sample according to the Brazil's national census, right? A second aspect is foreign policy issues in Brazil are not as divisive as domestic issues, right? So there is some consensus among Brazilians, whether they are wealthy Brazilians or not so wealthy Brazilians, they have similar positions in many foreign policy issues. So this is also important. So why this is something that we are now investigating in our new strand of research, which is why is that happening? If it's still happening, and if it's still happening, why does that happen, right? Why do you ask a Brazilian who has own elementary school about, I don't know, their view on Israel will be a similar answer to what Brazilians that have a very high income. They have similar, of course it's not the same, but they have similar answers. Right? And that's the third aspect that I said. There isn't a significant disparity between the perspectives of the elite and the general population on foreign policy issues, right? And the fourth one is that this consensus that we thought we had based on the surveys from 2010 all the way to 2022 might be changing. We are now presenting at the State of São Paulo Research Fund a new request for funding. And one of the questions we have on this new project is that, is the consensus still out there? Or Bolsonarism, the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil and the rise of the far right is changing how Brazilians or a part of Brazilians are thinking about foreign policy. Because in our 2022/2023 sample survey, there was some indications that there was a group of Brazilians who have in a growing group of Brazilians who had a very different perspective of foreign policy than the majority of the Brazilians. And this was changing. And there is a lot to speculate on that. Is this changing because Bolsonaro gives to the Bolsonarism elite, the politicians give to their voters a different worldview, and so this worldview is very different from the traditional view of Brazilians in foreign policy in general. Right? Is this consensus breaking down? And if it is breaking down, this will eventually affect Brazil's foreign policy itself. Right? And finally, the one that it's like dear to my heart is that I have an intuition, Ivan and we have an intuition that more and more Brazilian foreign policy is affecting the president's approval rating. When you look at the history of Brazilian foreign policy and how Brazilian foreign policy elite thought about foreign policy, they thought, well, what actually makes make the voters go to vote and decide whether they're going to vote for this president or the other is economics, inequality, security, and all that. We are not disputing all that, but we have some evidence. We cannot for sure argue, but we have some evidence that foreign policy, some decisions in foreign policy, is affecting the president's from a negative point of view. So it's declining the president's approval rate. Of President Lula, for example, right now. We believe, and that's again, this is our intuition based on some evidence, not in the data that we have, but on the data that Quaes and Atlas Intel have, that, for example, Brazil's position on the war in Gaza has negatively affected President Lula's approval rating. Because Brazil's official position on that issue goes against the majority, as I will show in some of the graphs here, against the majority perspective, the majority of Brazilian people's perception on the issue of Israel and Palestine. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the president has to enact a foreign policy based on what the people think, or the president has to enact a foreign policy based on the opportunity of the international arena? What we think in our group is that there is no more escape. I think more and more Brazilian presidents, just like any other European president or prime minister, they will have to enact a foreign policy. There is both a reflection of what Brazilians think and the opportunities of international arena. The idea that the president was free to enact and design its foreign policy all based only on the opportunity seen in the international arena might be finished. The president cannot do that anymore. I think Bolsonaro realized that. Lula has maybe not realized so much yet, and some needs, I don't know if he as president will realize that or not. But based on the data that we have from these other pollsters, there is some indication to that regard. I'm not saying that foreign policy decides votes in Brazil, but I think it composed the decision of voting, right? So these are the general main findings. So now just gonna be quickly here, because we won't have much time, about some general findings about what we have. Just we have a report that is gonna be available on the website soon that has all the perceptions. First, and I think it talks to our partnership between ECFR and us, which is Brazilians hold generally favorable views towards the West. We have here Professor Leslie Bentel has a number of one paper that I quote all the time in all my studies, and asking Brazilians, and from academic point of view, not asking Brazilians, but discussing if Brazilians are part of the West or not, if they are Latin Americans, do they see themselves to be Latin Americans? And Juan, I don't know if you're aware of that, but Brazilians don't see themselves as Latin Americans. We see ourselves as Brazilians. We think that we are a little different from the rest. We are a little different from the rest. But that's this is a longer discussion on that. But are Brazilians Western? I know that the Western countries don't see ourselves as Western so much, which is odd. But the majority of Brazilians think themselves to be part of the West. That doesn't mean that they were going to agree with the foreign policy of Western countries, like say in the war in Ukraine or Israel and Gaza, but they see themselves as such. So in this sense, when you ask Brazilians about what their perception about the United States or France or the UK or Germany is always way more positive than negative. That's one of the reasons Brazilians immigrate so much. You don't see many Brazilians immigrating, let's say, to China or Russia. You see Brazilians immigrating to Portugal. We are taking over Portugal. Soon enough, we'll be completely Brazilian, right? So this is one of the graphs. Of the following words, which one best describes your feelings towards the United States? We have many data there. You can look it up. Well, admiration is the first one, right? But that's one thing. About China, Brazilians don't have the same depth in their perception about China as they have towards the United States, for example. For Brazilians, this is transactional view of China. It's something that is very controversial, even among ourselves in the research. This is my wording. It's not Ivan's wording. He'll present you better data about China in a little bit. But in general, based on the numbers we have, we believe that Brazilians, when they look at China, they look from a transactional point of view. So China is a business opportunity. It's not values. It's not cooperation in a deeper sense. That's, of course, a general perspective. Of course, there is division among Brazilians. Some type of Brazilians, like if you're more leftist, you have a more encompassing view of the China. If you're more right wing, you have you're more suspicious of China. We can control by the difference of voters there. But this is a general view, right? Of the following words we best describe China, I cannot see which one. Admiration is there, contempt is there, and contempt does not appear in the American side. In general terms, how do you describe China's influence in Brazil? Positive, but also negative. Right? So if you ask some of and I compared some of the data to ECFR when I went to ECFR in Berlin last year, it's very different. Very, very different. So that goes back. We are part of the West, but we perceive China in a very different fashion. Right? So there is something to explore and try to understand why this happened. Right? Again, this is something that I'm and Ivan, we are writing an article about. We run a couple of questions about the U.S.-China rivalry, how Brazilians perceive the rivalry. Again, this is very different from Europeans because we're not part of the rivalry directly. Affect Europeans are because of NATO, because the relationship with the ACFR is opening. Where are you opening a new office? In Washington D.C. or Beijing? You're opening in Washington D.C. So you have a very different relationship with the United States. We are far from that. We're never going to be a NATO country. We're never going to be fully allied with the Chinese. We have this position in the world as the title of our presentation is a strategic autonomy perspective. And when you ask Brazilians about the rivalry per se, you see Brazilians are divided, but the 50% of the answers go to remain neutral and not support either power. I think this is very strong. More than 50% of Brazilians say we should not side with the United States, neither the United States nor China. And we have more data on that. And my speculation that Brazilians say that because they think it's a threat. It's a risk to take sides. Right? We'll be wrong in our part. Then there is this, every time I go to Europe, to any European panels, they always ask me the questions about BRICS. I have a pre-prepared positive view about BRICS. I'm super in favor of Brazil being a member of BRICS. But when you ask Brazilians about BRICS, you'll see there is no consensus. And then on the BRICS is one of the few questions that when we ask Brazilians, the no, I don't know answer go up a little bit, go in the last survey 2023, go up to 15%, 14%. So for example, we have a number of sentences. I'm going to read a sentence, would like you to know if you agree or disagree. The BRICS are a force capable of balancing global power in the face of traditional powers such as the United States, Germany, and Japan. Partially agree, you see the decline from 2014 to 2013. But agreeing with this sentence is a little higher than disagreeing. But there is another question that is the opposite of this one, and then the reverses. So there is no consensus about BRICS among the Brazilian people. One thing is the Brazilian elite and how they perceive BRICS, another thing how the Brazilian people think. It's hard to explain why. We're trying to speculate and understand this. My guess is that because when they look at BRICS, if they know this, and then the question goes, BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. When they see Russia there, it's complicated because, and if you look at the report, we ask Brazilians what they think about a number of countries. We have our diplomat from Belgium. We don't ask Brazilians about Belgium. I'm sorry. But if we ask Brazilians about Belgium, they will give you a positive answer. They think most of the European countries are seen in a very positive fashion, but Russia, it's seen as a complication. And there is a question: which of these powers you see are more favorable for world peace? The United States go up like first place, and Russia is very, very low. So either Brazilians don't know Russia very well, or they perceive Russia. We cannot say because we don't have specific questions about Russia, but they don't see Russia in a very positive fashion. They don't see in a very negative fashion either, because Brazilians don't see any country in a very negative fashion. But Russia is not so positive. So maybe this is affecting BRICS. If we put Russia and China together, that might be affected. And finally, the last one, divergent views on Israel-Palestine. Right? We asked, in your opinion, given the scenario of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, I think I wrote Palestinians wrong. What position do you believe Brazil should adopt? And you see that stay away from the conflict is number one. And I thought, when I designed this question, I thought to support the two-state solution, which is the official position of the Brazilian government, would be the highest one, but it's not. Actually, Brazilians see that as a problem. But the sad part is that to be closer to Palestine is only 1% of the Brazilian people. And we have 5 questions about Israel and Palestine. Those numbers are collected before the current conflict. On the report, we have newer data collected after the conflict. There was Atlas Intel research survey, and then you see the Brazilians in general. Brazilians have a very positive view of Israel and a negative view of Palestine. Right, that's a general overview of the Brazilians. But when it comes to the conflict and how the country Brazil should position itself vis-a-vis the conflict, then you see the Brazilians are backing up. I'm gonna write a book one day based on all this data, and I think my book will be, Ivan doesn't know that yet, but the title of the book is going to be Brazilians the Prudent, because Brazilians are very prudent. When you look at this data, they are never ever radical to one side or the other, whether China or the United States. They don't see anything in a very negative fashion. We have a very interesting paper that Ivan and I wrote about Brazil's regional leadership. And we run a survey in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, asking the Brazilians, the Argentinian, and the Mexicans about their country's regional leadership, if they support it or not. We created 3 scenarios, and we thought the Brazilians will, back then, with like Brazilians will support Brazil's regional leadership. When you look at the Argentina data, the Argentinians fully support the Argentinian regional leadership. The Mexicans, 100%. All Mexicans. We are in favor of Mexico should be the leader of Latin America. If you ask Brazilians, they say no. It's not with us. It's not our thing. That goes back. I think that's again my intuition. It's like a general interpretation. The Brazilians are very prudent and very skeptical in the way they see Brazil engage into international issues in general. Might be that they think, well, we're going to spend a lot of money that we don't have. We're going to make an investment, something that is maybe not so important for a country. That goes back to the idea that we in Brazil live in an island. We're so far away from world problems, and we are so isolated and protected by the area where we live, because we have Atlantic on one side, France on the other side, a huge chain of mountains in the other. So we are protected. Geography might be explaining this. So Pavel, thank you very much for being here. Of course, I spoke too much. I'm gonna pass the word now to Ivan. He's gonna have better data. He's the guy who knows everything about how Brazilians think of China. Ivan, thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's a very pleasure to be here at CEBRI. I was here in 2011 doing my master dissertation. I was doing some interviews here, so I'm very happy to be here as a professor. And also, I think that we have a lot to cooperate between CEBRAP and the project that we have in CEBRAP that put together a lot of academics in São Paulo with CEBRI. We made a huge effort using the funding from FAPESP that could financiate the representative surveys that we did since 2010. And I think we did a lot of work on that it's more on the scientific journals and it's not so much in the public opinion debate. People doesn't know about what we are doing there in CEBRAP because we are people from the university. We are talking with people from other universities in the meeting of the Encontro da Associação Brasileira de Ciência Política, o Encontro da Associação Brasileira de Relações Internacionais. So we need to engage better with the public opinion, and we don't know how to do that. Feliciano is much better than me on that. I'm a really guy from the university, but I think we can do this cooperation with CEBRI. And the second point that I think that is important to be here is that we could make the representative surveys, but we have much difficult to do the elite sample because once again we are people from the university. We don't have the high level connections that Amaury de Souza had when he ran the first survey of elites. He did something that it was really the Brazilian elites that were thinking about international relations. We try to mimic that, but we could never do the same quality sample that he had in 2011, 2001, and 2008. He had run two surveys before us. So I think that we can put together the efforts in CEBRI and CEBRAP to produce this information. Yeah. So as Feliciano had introduced, we are working to understand what are the positions of Brazil, not just on China by itself, but we are thinking on the how we see the effects of China emergence. Because we have some questions in the previous surveys that point to something that was not so clear for us. So we need to explore a little more that we don't have a problem with China. We see China in a positive way. We don't have a problem with the United States. We see the United States in a positive way. We always see European countries in a positive way also. But we have a problem with China emergence. We have a question that, what do you think that China's emergence brings to the world? We say it's a threat. It's a very important problem. So what's the motivation behind these attitudes? And we think that we are not worried about China. We are worried about the potential conflict that the emergence of China can bring to the world. So it's not something specific for the way the politics in China is run, the way we are culturally distant from China, but that is two powers. Two powers can make war more easily than when we are in a unipolar world. So what we try to grasp in this new survey, we try to protect the interviews from direct perceiving what we're trying to understand. So we use tools from survey experiments that we can put aside what are our real intentions with that question. That we think we always have to realize that when we are talking about surveys, we put a question for the people to respond. So the guy is running in the street. Some people stop it. Well, can you spend 10 minutes answer those questions for me? So I ask for them, what do you think about free trade? And what we have in our data since 2010, Brazilians love free trade. There's a very strong support for free trade. But we don't have free trade in Brazil. Brazil is the biggest protectionist country, the emerging country in the world. So what's the difference? Because I really think that, okay, when you ask for a Brazilian that if he likes free trade, he say, oh, I like free trade. Free trade is a good idea. But you will not vote on that. I will vote on many other things. I will vote on many other issues. But you put the questions. So you try to create another scenario that the guy is not realizing what you are asking. So what we did that using the survey experiment, and we are trying to understand two dimensions. The first, what's the perceptions of Chinese threat? What's the reasons, the motivations of Chinese threats? And how we see the competition between United States and China in South America. So what we do in this survey experiment, we present some phrase for the respondent, and he needs to say how many of that annoy you. So we say something like the federal government tax increase on gasoline and diesel, Brazil qualification for the World Cup, large companies polluting the environment without being penalized. So random phrases that we are not going to ask which one it's like you, but the numbers of ones that is like. So we present for the control group those three phrases, and for those that we are trying to understand the effects of China, we present three new different phrases that we can present. For the threat scenario, you present these three phrases. The rise of China as an authoritarian international power. It annoy you, or it don't annoy you. If the guy thinks, oh, that can be something kind of racist to see China as a problem, but I'm not going to ask you if you don't like China. I will just ask you how many of those phrases you don't like. So you are protected to do that. Yeah. 3, 2, 1. Of course, we are not talking about the facts on the interview, but in the Brazilian whole sample, in Brazilian whole population. The second phrase is the rise of China as international power that is culturally distant from Brazil. So the first part, I don't like China because it's authoritarian. I don't like China because it's culturally distant from Brazil. And the third one is the rise of China as international power and adversary of the United States. I don't like China because it's a rival of the United States. For the scenario of South America competition, we think that we want to understand if Brazilians are worried about China presence in the region, American presence in the region, or both presence in the region. So we put these three phrases. Brazil lose influence in South America with the increased Chinese presence in the region. Second one, Brazil lose influence in South America with the great American presence in the region. The third one, Brazil lose influence in South America with a great Chinese and American presence in the region. So after that, we run the experiment and we have the data. What is fantastic that there's no difference among anyone. Brazilians are annoyed by the fact that China can represent a threat. We are hoping, actually was our first guess when we are proposing the experiment, that China as US adversary could be a little more annoying. But actually, if there is China, people are a little more annoyed. If he is a US adversary, it's a culturally distant China, and a little bit more if it's authoritarian China. But when we run the statistical tests, there is no difference between those three questions, but there is a difference between the control group. So China is annoying the Brazilian respondents.
It's an experiment. It means that we are comparing 3 scenarios to a control group. The control group, the lower line, has no word of China. So we ask Brazilian about 3 questions. They will give answer either 2 or 3. And then we compare this. So we divided the sample in 4 groups. We compare this to the other 3. So if the answers of the other 3 are different from the control group, and the other 3 scenarios always have a China word in it, China's adversary, China as cultural distant, authoritarian, then you make this comparison. By making the comparison, you can realize if these words about China are having an effect in the way that people answer. And our hope, as Ivan said, is that Brazilians will prefer one of the 3 over the control. Will be very, very clear. But if you look the interval of confidence, which is in the graph like this, they're all in the same line. There, you can't make a difference between them. But as Ivan said, China annoys Brazilians. There is something there that they don't like very much.
And the second one, we are asking about the next slide, that is about the Chinese presence. Once more, here we have a very small significant effect of China-US presence in South America. It's not so clear. If you run more complex statistical tests, the significant results washes away. So it's in the margins. So we are not so confident on that. But there is something here that Brazilians are more worried, are more annoyed. That is the exact word that we use in the survey, when there is the presence of China and US in South America. So the difference between China and US washes away in this scenario. When we put the phrase that China presence in South America annoys you, this is the same exact effect of US presence in South America. That is, once more, evidence that goes to the new book that Feliciano is going to write. The Brazilians are prudent about that. They don't like that Chinese or Americans are in South America. And the worst scenario is that when both of these countries are in South America. So,
Thank you, Ivan.
thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Fabio, you have the floor.
No, thanks. It's a fascinating discussion, and I'm also looking forward to hearing what Isabel will have to say in her reactions. Listen, so we came all that way from a distant Europe, about which you are perhaps not thinking at all if you have such a wonderful beach and the sun, tasty fruit. I think that better not ask about Europe, because then it will turn out that people are not thinking about us that much. So we came all that way not to tell you what Brazil thinks, or even worse, to tell you what Brazil should think. But yeah, we are here to learn, and learn mostly about Brazil's foreign policy. So here it's worth make a step back, although you already discussed this, that's why I found it also very fascinating, that actually the link between public opinion and foreign policy is not obvious. I've been working on public opinion on foreign policy already for 5 years, and developing this line of research at ECFR. And at the beginning, we faced a backlash, like people were questioning, why should we bother about public opinion on foreign policy? People don't think about it. It requires an expert knowledge. I think that throughout those years, many of the people who were questioning it understood that actually public opinion on foreign policy matters. Also, the public started having more of an opinion on on foreign affairs, which is due to various things which affect their daily life, from COVID to the war in Ukraine, or the one in Palestine. So today, people actually are paying a lot of attention whenever we publish a study which shows what people think about foreign policy in Europe. I think that the public opinion can be useful in 2 ways here. So first of all, it can be a reflection of the elite debate or the foreign policy debate. So if you want to understand what is Lula doing, or what is happening in any of the European countries when it comes to foreign policy, how government is acting, then public opinion can be a reflection, and therefore helps you understand what is happening in the MFAs.
But I also believe that public opinion is more than just a reflection, that it's also a factor. And I don't think that the leaders in the world, and perhaps mostly in democratic societies, this is important because they are elected regularly. But I don't think that leaders necessarily are guided by public opinion, but I believe that they at least see it as a constraint. So sometimes you cannot run a foreign policy independently if your public opinion is completely against it. Although there might be occasions where strategic interests of your country actually force you to act against what the public opinion is doing and to focus on shaping that public opinion. Sometimes if there is a mismatch between the two, that simply shows that you have done your communication job poorly, and that you have to invest in it more. So I'm not going to tell you what Brazil thinks, but I am going to tell you what we think that Brazil thinks, because we have also done our opinion polling at the end of last year in 10 non-European countries, including Brazil, largely because we wanted to understand what's the opportunity for Europe to work with different players across the world on foreign policy issues which are crucial to us Europeans. So I will take the command as well. We did this. We did this poll. Sorry. Oh, okay. So we did this survey in 11 European countries and 10 countries outside Europe, including Brazil. What I believe it shows, but I'm here also to learn from you whether we understand the Brazilian perception correctly and whether you believe that the public opinion on those issues actually reflects the foreign policy of your country. Like what we have seen is that there is a sort of a la carte approach to foreign policy, which is clearly visible in Brazil. Again, we are talking about America and China, not about Europe, but we asked people in those different places whether they would go with America or with a Chinese bloc of countries if they were forced to choose between the two. And in Brazil, we can see that in such a situation, if there is a need to choose between the two hegemons, then Brazilians would clearly go with the Americans. 2/3 of Brazilians are saying, let's go with the American bloc of countries. Just 14% is saying, let's go with China. But and on this, you are similar to India and to South Korea. And actually, you are one of the countries, together with South Korea and with India, where there is the lowest number of people who would be tempted to go with China. On this, you clearly differ from South Africa, for example, or Saudi Arabia. But where you are similar to those other countries, and which is a clue of the matter for me, is that you are not expecting ever to be forced to choose between the two. So we asked people, okay, which of the following views do you agree with more? One is that it is realistically possible for your country to have good relations with both China and the US. This is the blue part of the bars. Or, to the contrary, it's not realistically possible to have good relations with China and the US, and therefore you need to pick one side or the other. And here, Brazil is clearly one of those countries where a majority is saying, no, we actually can have good relations with both China and the US. Perhaps you are somehow worried that might not be the case, but in those responses, we see that actually few people think that there might be a need to pick sides. And on this matter, you differ quite substantially from South Korea, which, because of its location, clearly there are a lot of people, almost half of the public, who is thinking that actually there will arrive a moment when they will have to choose. China, from our analysis, looks like mostly an economic attraction. So we also asked people in those different places, and I'm also only displaying the data for Brazil. With whom would they go? With the US and their partners, or with China and its partners on the various issues? And Brazilians would clearly ally with Americans on human rights, security, or internet governance, there is also a majority of your population who would ally with the US on trade. But this is the single issue where there is actually quite a substantial share of the population, 1/3 of Brazilians, who would pick China over the US when it comes to trade, which shows that this area is really important. We also asked a different thing on the acceptance of various sorts of Chinese investment in your country. And we can see that there is a lot of acceptance for all of these different sorts. So 2/3 of Brazilians would be happy to see China building infrastructure like bridges and ports, or buying a tech company in Brazil. More than half of your population would be happy to see China buy a sports team. Almost half of the Brazilians would accept China buying a newspaper or an electronic media. And the only area where you would have questions would be whether Chinese companies should be able to own infrastructure.
I only contest that buying a major sport team is absolutely wrong. Brazilians don't answer this correctly. If you had to put soccer, time de futebol, and that would change dramatically.
Maybe it's about buying a sports team of your rival.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Buying Vasco, Chinese buy Vasco, Flamenguista will say, yeah, you can buy Vasco. Take it, you can get it.
Yeah, this is a little bit more complex craft. It shows you net acceptance. So the difference between those people who see it as acceptable versus unacceptable to do those different sorts of Chinese investment in your country. And you can see that Brazil, together with Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Turkey, are the countries most happy to see Chinese investments and seeing this as least problematic. And on this, you clearly differ from not just South Korea, but also Indonesia or India, where some investments are seen as problematic. And therefore, I think that what stems from here, it's not the end of my presentation, but it's a transition. So we are in the middle. I think that what stems from this, our understanding of what Brazilian population thinks, and which might be also representative for the foreign policy of your country, is that you are pursuing an a la carte approach to foreign affairs, where you, depending on the area in question, whether it's security or trade or something else, you can actually afford to choose sides because you are a sovereign major international player. And I think that this is a fair approach on Brazil. You have the potential, the size, the power to pursue such an a la carte approach to foreign affairs. But my question is whether that approach is sustainable. And I think that here is the moment when the war in Ukraine, sorry to be a joy killer and to start talking about it, but well, I think that this is the moment when that war should be mentioned, because I'm not sure whether the international dynamic around that world, whether that would help Brazil make its point about the need for the international power to be distributed more multipolarly and in a more just way, or to the contrary, is it a moment when that case is lost rather than won? And let me also show you, because we have asked some questions about the war in Ukraine. It was in September, October last year, so in a largely different moment of that war. And I'm happy to discuss the war at any stage. I was in Kiev last week, so I'm following a lot the developments there and also the European public opinion on that matter. But we also wanted, when we conducted this survey, to see what the different international publics think about the war. And this is Brazil. We offered people everywhere free choices. So, but the bottom two are the crucial ones. So the orange part is about preferring peace, like at all cost, in the sense that these are the people who would say that the conflict needs to stop as soon as possible, even if it means that Ukraine needs to give up on some of its areas. In a way, it's similar to what President Lula once said, saying that Ukraine shouldn't believe that it can have it all. And so this is a prevailing view, like prevailing in the sense that the largest number of Brazilians associate themselves with such a view, 31%. Twice less people, that was quick, I'm coming back. So there are 15% in Brazil who are saying that that actually no, Ukraine needs to regain all of its territory, even if it means that the war will last longer. Significantly fewer people. And there is like one option which we gave so that people can also have a choice to associate themselves with a Russian perspective of this war, which is about this being a legitimate aggression. But this is just a margin in Brazil and everywhere except for Russia. So you can draw two conclusions from this chart. One is that there is a preference in Brazil for insisting on peace as soon as possible, rather than supporting Ukraine in the war effort. But for me, the main conclusion actually is that half of the Brazilian population does not know or does not care. And frankly speaking, being here, having this wonderful sun, wonderful beaches, I think Europe feels so much distant that that I can imagine how the war can feel distant. Another thing which is worth mentioning about those responses is that we talk about, we call it public opinion, but actually I think that especially on foreign affairs, when we are talking about things that are distant, we only gather public reactions, impressions. So we should not be thinking that this is a stable opinion that people are having. Still, it is very telling to see that so many Brazilians don't know or don't associate themselves with any of those responses.
I was in Berlin when they showed. I was invited to comment on this in Berlin. So my comment on that. Can you go back to
Yes.
the previous
But
chart?
this is the same one. So simply.
Oh, okay. Is that the phrasing of the Russian side, in my opinion, was badly made for the case of Brazil. You should have, in the red one, you should be more clear that you're favoring Russia on that, Russian territorial aggression. I think if you do that, the number 4 will increase and the number none of these will decrease.
You
Because
think that
there
there
were
are many people
participation
who
of
would
Brazil.
support Russian aggression?
I think I think it's not majority at all, but it's higher than 4%.
I think that if we can make those Q&A before, that we don't see Western dominance because we are from West. We see American dominance. So if you put anti-Americanism in the question, perhaps I think we could have more percentage people choosing this one. And the second one, I think that none of those options is quite tough, tricky in Brazil, because most of those very tricky questions, when there is a escape answer, Brazilians like to go there. When you are put conflict on that, you are put violence on that, Brazilians like to choose I'm not going to any of the sides, because it's nice that if you put on the other slide, is the majority of people that is choosing none of those between all the countries.
Okay, so I have almost finished, and let I'm still waiting for Isabel to have an opportunity to speak. But let me just make the final point. So when we compare Brazil to other countries, also the rest of the non-European countries, the same option prevails of wanting to see peace in. Like the war in Ukraine is seen as a nuisance, something which annoys people because it can also make international cooperation more difficult, trade as well. But what I'm struck about is that it's Brazil and Indonesia where those numbers of people who don't know or have no opinion is actually the largest. So these are the places where this conflict perhaps feels the most abstract and distant. And not just on this question, we have also asked another one, which is about who is the biggest obstacle to peace between Russia and Ukraine. And 37% of Brazilians say, yeah, it's Russia, but still, it's not a majority. There are fewer people who blame EU, Ukraine, or the US, but there are still almost half of the Brazilian population who are saying, don't know, someone else, things like that. I feel that this is important to acknowledge, because it's, from the European perspective, it's very easy to misunderstand Brazilian approach to war in Ukraine, and to think that you are not supporting Europe or the US on the occasion where you should. And I think that perhaps Europe and the US have made several mistakes in how they approach the government in Brazil, as if they naturally expected you to do things which you could not do. However, I think that the war in Ukraine is still an important moment on which you should also, as Brazilians, reflect seriously, because it poses several questions as to whether your approach to global affairs, foreign policy, is sustainable. I have a full list of questions, but I will just mention 3, and then I'm finished. So, so one is whether Brazil can really expect that European Union and European countries could help you gain a more prominent role globally and support you, whether it's about the seat at the Security Council or a more just representation in international institutions, if the war in Ukraine so far has proved to be rather a moment of disillusion with Brazil than of appreciation for your role from the perspective of many European players. The second question is whether the war in Ukraine isn't showing that word of having good relations with China and its allies and US in its allies will quickly become difficult to sustain, because what we see from the European perspective as emerging is China, Russia, Iran as a bloc which is increasingly working together, and this makes this scenario of a certain bipolar order more likely than it was in the past. How prepared Brazil is to avoid such a scenario, or to live in a world where it can no longer use its a la carte approach to world affairs. And the final point, more practical, is that I understand that the government of Brazil and the president of Brazil have had several ideas as to how to support peace between Ukraine and Russia, and this kind of reflects the public mood, where people would also have a preference for ending the conflict soon, even if it means Ukraine giving up on some areas, than supporting Ukraine. But frankly speaking, I have no clue where Brazil currently is with its support for peace. What I hear is that Switzerland is soon organizing a peace conference, expecting about 100 of countries coming to Switzerland to show a certain support for peace in that part of the world. And what I also hear is that it's uncertain whether Brazil will actually be happy to attend. So if you have any news about that, I'm more than happy to hear about it.
Thank you, Pavel. Professor Isabel, thank you very much for being here. It's always a pleasure. Professor Isabel from the Catholic University of Rio, right around the corner. She can walk here.
Thank you. Thank you all for the invitation. It's always very nice to be here as well. And I'm really glad to having been able to read the report, the first version, I mean the last version, I think, and to get to know in more details both of the research projects. And I'm fascinated by some of the results. I mean, like some of you, actually, even more than you, all I have is intuition and a few hypotheses. I don't have the answers, definitely not. But I do have several questions, and hopefully those might take us into a very helpful and rich debate. So to start with some of the points that Feliciano and Ivan raised in their research. One thing that struck me was how very spread were the results regarding how people perceive the BRICS, the war in Ukraine, Venezuela, but also the conflict Israel-Palestine. It felt almost like we have the same kind of distribution for these four completely different topics. And we have positive views, we have negative views, we have people who are unaware or they are indifferent, more or less at around the same percentage for each one of those topics. So for Ukraine. So for instance, when it comes to Israel and Palestine, you have 30% neutrality, but you say, to quote your own report, you say there are deep divisions, 30% rejects Brazilian position, but 30% also support the Brazilian position. So you say that yourself as well in the report. The views are quite polarized. And the same comes when it comes to Ukraine. There are many divergences, more or less to the same proportion. The same when it comes to the BRICS. And then listening to both your presentations, both research projects, I feel we come to a very similar conclusion, or a non-conclusion, a hypothesis or an intuition, that Brazilians do like to engage and feel interest in general about foreign policy, even when they don't know exactly, they don't know the details, they don't have formal knowledge about the theme. And the question that you have is one that I have, and it's really important to me as well. Why do we have experts and lay people, people with less formal education, more or less taking the same positions about very complex issues? I don't think that happens in many countries. I think that's very peculiar to Brazil. And I think that has something to do, but I can only hypothesize. I don't have, definitely don't have answers to that. But I think culturally and historically, we are very much attuned to that thought that the neighbor's grass is always greener than ours. And perhaps because of that, we're always fascinated about the neighbor's grass. And that makes, I don't know, I think people in general are interested in knowing to some extent what's happening around the world. But maybe that's it. That's as far as we go. We don't necessarily see people wanting to know in details about everything, but they do want to know that there is a world out there, which is more than we can say about many people in many places. So I think that's a positive point for us. But it's not, we don't go that far, obviously. And also very much so because of a lack of education in that area. So I was wondering what perhaps you can talk about, and that question obviously goes more to you, Feliciano and Ivan, about your methodology. Because my feeling is that for all those kinds of research projects, and I really like what you said, Pavel, that we have reactions, we don't have opinions, because my feeling is the same. People, especially now with social media, people will have thoughts about everything, especially if they feel compelled to express their ideas, or if they feel they are invited to do so. They will say something, but that doesn't mean they necessarily have a view on that. Maybe they just thought about something, or they just have one keyword in mind, or maybe they just have a yes or no in mind. So maybe in your methodology, I don't know if that makes sense, or even if you include that before, and I would love to hear more, it would make sense to have an open question, a narrative question that's quite easy to respond, but that kind of make people engage in a more detailed level with at least one topic of foreign policy, and kind of gauge and measure their real engagement with foreign policy, and then from there categorize the questions and the answers in the survey. Because then you have an idea of those people who are at the highest level of engagement with foreign policy. Maybe the way they think about the conflicts, like the Ukraine conflict, and Israel-Palestine will have a different weight and than the other groups, depending on what kind of questions and research questions you have. And then I was also thinking, because I know the European Union has been funding several research projects about public opinion and the relationship between the EU and Brazil. So a few of my colleagues are publishing another one of those studies this week, and it's on the experts' view on Brazil, on Brazilians' opinion on foreign policy. And I was also struck by one of their conclusions, because the experts, I think they interviewed 1,000 experts in Brazil, and they said that 83% of them were very dissatisfied with the government and how the government has been leading our foreign policy agenda. But the results that you showed lead me to think that perhaps the general population is not that unhappy with the way the government is dealing with foreign policy in general. So that's both a question, but also maybe an intuition, just throwing it out there. I feel like that might be the change or the difference that we don't see between the other groups and the experts. That might be one difference. And the other comment and question that I wanted to make, I think I'm trying to connect both research projects because I think they speak a lot to each other. In general, from the data that you gather and the presentations that you just made, I also feel like there are indications of greater concern with the economy in general and economic issues, and not so much with structural inequalities in the international system or geopolitics or politics in general. So that phrase, "it's economic, stupid," comes to mind. It's economic, and economic. For instance, one of the things that I think you point out in your report is that there is a lot of hope in the G20 and the feeling that there are other contexts where we can fight for a more equal international system when it comes to the economy, and trade. But we don't see it so much in those questions, and we don't see the general public engaging with geopolitics or politics. And as you say, maybe we are prudent and we don't want to have a say in those conflicts, or we go only as far as saying, okay, we want peace. We preferably want peace as soon as possible. And I wonder then if our engagement with foreign policy would be richer and more effective, and both in domestically speaking, and of course in terms of how we engage with the international system, if we were to play a role in strengthening the multilateral system and investing in global governance in general, because it feels like that's the only area where we speak politics, we speak the language of politics. That's so as far as we go as a population or as Brazilians. We don't like going further than that, perhaps. And historically, that's where we also have our strength. That's where we made history, more or less. Even though, as Pavel was saying, it's true that the institutions have so far failed in the major conflicts, and that has weighted a lot against them in the past couple of years. But perhaps there is a place for Brazil to have a leadership, to exercise leadership in that sense, in reforming global governance and reforming multilateral institutions in general. And this is one of the priorities of the current government in the G20, for instance. When it comes to the relationship between Brazil and the EU, I think that would require the EU to see Brazil as a more equal partner when it comes to sitting at the table, because perhaps we don't want to talk about geopolitics, we don't want to talk about politics, but we do want to have a political role, which are different things. So I think those are my main comments and considerations. Oh, just one more thing. So we're talking about a strategic interdependence. And of course, we are comparing our relationships with the US and with China. And again, I wonder, when does dependence become grievance? You say that annoyance is a word that applies a lot to how we feel about China, apparently, in your research. Not so much against the US, but a little bit too. So we don't like seeing other people maybe in our area or in our territory of influence. So when does dependence become grievance? China is our main trade partner right now. The EU is the second when it comes to the value of exports. And the EU is the first when it comes to foreign direct investment in Brazil. We don't seem to resent the EU so much. So it would be wonderful to have an idea what the mechanisms are and what the conditions are that turn dependence into grievance, because we will have a future agenda with China, definitely. And I think those are my main comments, I guess. I would love to hear more about both research projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Isabel. Thank you for your very good comments, especially this last question that you posed. When does dependence become grievance? I think this is based on the data, it's impossible for us to answer. I don't know if Ivan has any thoughts on that, but that's a very good question. I'm going to speculate a little bit on Pavel's questions and your questions here. I don't know how much time we have. On the, I think I like the hypothesis of greener grass on the neighborhood, right? I think my intuition is this, and that goes a little bit with your saying that impressions versus opinions, right? Is that when you pose a survey to the people in general, these are face-to-face surveys that we have. We are now starting with online surveys that the sample goes up because we have more access to people, to 2,000 to 4,000 people. But we spend a lot of money over this last 10 years. We spent more than 3 million reais on face-to-face surveys, 1,500, 1,800 people with a margin of error of 2.2%. So the surveyor goes to the congregation areas with a lot of people, and they get the data from the people. It's a 50 questions to 60 questions survey. What happens is that if you look at the I don't know answer declines over time, as it takes 40 minutes for the survey to be finalized. It means that the survey informs the interviewer. The interviewer, he learns about issues as he answers them. So that goes to the discussion, is it really an opinion or an impression? So methodologically speaking, one of the best ways to figure this out, the difference between a structured opinion and just some general impression, is to, if you have some money, you need a lot of money because you need to focus on a specific subject issue, and then you run a survey, let's say China, for example, several questions about China. You run a survey about China, and you get the data, and then based on these results, you come up with a series of other methodological tools, like a focus group. You bring up people of 20 people that resembles the sample into a room, and then you make in-depth questions trying to understand the mechanism behind the construction of the impression or opinion, right? So you have a deeper understanding, because if you just use open question survey plus survey experiments, which is a different tool within the same survey, you don't actually grasp the mechanism, why the person thinks that way, where this is coming from. So that's one thing. We need more money, more capacity to improve our methodology in order to actually understand what is behind because it's very difficult. What we can show is like what they think, and then we cannot say if it's just an impression or if it's a structural opinion, right? So over time, by having so many surveys over time, then we can say it is a structural opinion because these answers are stable over time, right?
I think that this is a very common question on public opinion survey, not just about international relations, but on any matters, because you are talking with random people, with Homer Simpsons around the world, how they can put themselves around very difficult and technical issues. But as the public opinion research agenda has evolved, since I think the classical book of John Zeller, The Nature, I went to Wikipedia to say the right title, the natural and origins of mass opinion. There is clues, heuristics, and mechanisms that random people, normal people uses to position themselves on social issues, on security issues, and also international issues. So I think that we can understand what the effects of opinion, but there is something there. And we can see if this is reliable using two methodological tools. First of all, what is consistent over time. There's the same pattern that it happens over time, and we see that in our data. And also, if it's consistent across the survey. So we run a lot of similar related regression hierarchical models to understand if the guy that is telling something about anti-Americanism in question 1 is going to say something about related to anti-Americanism in question 10. And what is very interesting in our survey that we run the same model for the 2014 and for 2018 survey, and it works. It works quite well. So we have information that is consistent over time, and it's consistent across inside the survey. So these are clues that indicates that despite the fact that people is not well informed, they can position themselves in very complex issues.
Yeah, that goes, and that's so the consistent and the structure is there. So, and then now I have a PhD student. Ivan is going to participate in the examining board, and he's trying to understand how this operates. So how the people that don't have a formal education, they're taking the bus on the street to run to work, and they're stopped and they're asked about Ukraine. How do they create this structure? So, and the literature shows that there might be some cognitive shortcuts, which is people don't know much about Ukraine, but they hear and they read in social media, they hear on TV. So the elite, which means the diplomats and the journalists, they, by saying every day, talking about this issue every day, they construct with people's mind what they think about the issue. So they take shortcuts. And if the person is a right-wing, far-right, Bolsonaro supporter, he'll say, no matter what, the European Union is bad. There's no way he's going to say it, but if I ask him a question about it. So that's another thing. He extract from his ideological view, and then how he sees the world that way. That all to say that people know what they're talking about. They're not just giving random answers. They know it. We don't know how much they know, but they know what they're talking about. That goes back to my previous arguments that foreign policy, if they know they're talking about foreign policy, matter for politics. I mean, it affects people's government approval rating, even maybe the vote. So this is something that we have there. As Lula not so bad, there was yesterday there was an EPEC, which is another publisher from Brazil, showed some numbers about approval rating of Lula, and foreign policy has more dislikes than likes. Right? So it was a 37% disapproval and only 30% support. On that survey, it's very difficult because they're asking about many questions like economics, health, security. So there is contamination. So because they don't like the government in general, so they don't like the foreign policy. So it's difficult to disentangle and to separate. We need to analyze better this data. It's hard to tell today if Lula's current foreign policy has a higher support than has a good, it's popular or not. My intuition is that it's not. There is a more negative view than a positive view. But it's my intuition. Right? I think you're absolutely right about economics versus geopolitics, and it goes back to my argument of being prudent. I think when it comes to hard politics, hard geopolitical issues, Brazilians seem to be more prudent. When it comes to economics and trade, then that's why China has a more positive view. We see China as a trade opportunity. And if you compare the results we have on China to other Latin American countries, the other Latin American countries, it's more common to see China as a threat because the Chinese investment is much larger. You see Chinese investments in everyday life. Brazil has such a big economy. Chinese can make as much investments here that they won't change Brazil's landscape, and we don't see as a threat. In this sense, my general idea is that and it goes to your argument, we feel more secure in Brazil. Again, size of the economy, size of the country, long history of independence, and we have no civil war, we have no threats from our neighbors. We're 10 neighbors and we get along with them, we just beat them in soccer every year. There's nothing that actually maybe Venezuela now becomes an issue if Venezuela decides. So it's a Venezuelan decision, not our decision. So I think that has to do. But again, it's an intuition of why Brazilians tend to be more prudent and tend to see foreign policy, tend to see issues in economics more positive, and they have higher support than geopolitics. So that's my general. And that answers a little bit your first question, which is this: when you ask Brazilians about the BRICS, Venezuela, Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, then you see a lot of division. I think this on the car here, on the right here, I was talking to Ivan, saying, Ivan, we need to figure out what is the number one foreign policy issue on Brazilians' mind. Because when we run the surveys, we ask them about many issues, and we don't know if, and that goes back to the question about Lula's support for Lula's foreign policy. We don't know which is the issue that are in people's mind when they say that foreign policy is better. Maybe there is a hierarchy of issues. So I think people care more about not the way we relate with the United States or Europe or China, but how is the Israel-Palestine issue in the war in Ukraine. I think these two issues are more in people's minds. That's why I was very struck by the I don't know answer in our survey, because by looking at our survey, these are the issues that people think about foreign policy. They think about this because these are the issues our own media. But again, this is a speculation. I'm not sure. Yeah, exactly. It's these are the issues that are in people's mind, and then they say, okay, how is Brazilian government behaving on those issues? And then they will say, it's going bad. If you the question about Israel there, we didn't show here, but the other question about Israel is that majority of Brazilians reject the Lula's position of the war. That's just that. On the Ukraine, just to answer, you have also very good questions on Ukraine. I'm gonna only answer one, then I'll pass the word to Ivan. If the things gets worse, right? If the competition between China and the United States becomes a very complicated issue for Brazil. First, again, goes back. We are isolated. We're far from the conflict. And I remember I was talking to an American diplomat, and he asked me, so if tomorrow we go to war against China over Taiwan, how does Brazil position itself? I say, Brazil will be neutral. Be sure of that. And if there's a global war, I think if it's a global war, either Brazil is going to be neutral or we're going to side with the United States. So, and I talked to a Brazilian diplomat who is currently at Mauro Vieira's cabinet. And I asked her, and I told her exactly the same story to her. I said, look, this is what I think. And she said, and I know her position. And she said, you will be certain that we'll be on the side of the United States. I'm not sure about that. It's in Mauro Vieira's cabinet. But that's telling too about Mauro Vieira's cabinet. But I was like, I think if the things really get complicated, because we're in this side of the world, because we're so close to the United States, our relationship with the US is so deep in many senses, we would side with the US, but it's impossible to do, because there will be a conflict between picking side and Brazil's traditional autonomy perspective, and we want to always have some options out there. Ivan, you have some?
Yeah, I think that those data from Pavel are very, very, very interesting. That can show us that I think is quite a thing that we are using only the Brazilian data. We have some data from Latin American countries in the beginning of the project, but in the end of the day, just we in Brazil and people from Mexico get the funding from that. We have a very problem to funding the research. Okay. Yeah, but I think that Brazil has a unique position in the world that is from West and global South. That I think in your research design, Brazil was put as a global South country. And the question was about Western dominance. And I think it's not quite well the way the things run in Brazil. I think in the morning we can be from the West, in the afternoon we are from the global South, and in the night we are not from anybody. We want to do our own thing. That we can easily go to these different roles and an international system, and we can give good reasons for that. Brazil was a capital of a European state. Rio de Janeiro was a capital of a European state 200 years ago. So I think that there is a different situation that Brazil is not Indonesia. Indonesia don't have the same maneuver in this conflict between United States and China that Brazil have. So that's, I think, the question that put some difference in the answers. And the second part that Feliciano has just told us, that whenever we run experiments look on just the normal questions, when there is issues about violence and war, Brazilians trying to be prudent, try to be more pacifist. And there's issues on economic matters, on trade, Brazil try to be more aggressive, try to have a more important role in the international relations. It's quite telling for me that the Brazilians just want the war in Ukraine stops, no matter what. That I think it's very connected with the data that we collected about Brazilians. And a third issues to respond to Isabel, that's when rivalry becomes grievance. We are just publishing a chapter on Brazilian anti-Americanism, and we look all the data that we have in our samples since 2010 to the last survey on Brazilians' opinion on the United States, and what we could understand, there is not so much movement on Brazilians' opinion on issues related to the American society. Because in the end of the day, every Brazilian, at least from our generation, was raised watching Friends, watching How I Met Your Mother in the television. So it's very close connections to the United States, to the American societies. But there is a lot of movement during the Trump government of rejection of the US government positions. So I think grievance, we can find that are the positions that are made about the state decisions of the other countries and not about the societies. And I think that is the biggest difference that United States had in Brazil against China. We don't have those kinds of connections with China. I don't know what's the sitcom that the Chinese are watching right now. We have the pragmatic connections. We have trade. We have economic growth that can be produced in Brazil. The biggest economic growth in the Brazilian history in per capita terms, not in the overall GDP increase, was a result of Chinese imports. That is 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So there is a pragmatic relations. There's not so close connection about the society. So I think that if we have a war between United States and China, the society will pressure Brazil to align with China. But I think, United States, sorry. But I think that the government will try to postpone this decision until there is any more room, or perhaps when it's possible to realize who is going to win the war. And after that, we are about to realize who is going to win the war. Brazil is going to be together. The Brazilian government is going to be together with the winner.
And I still have words.
I don't know how much time
I think we should be ending already.
soon. I'm not sure if so. Who's control? Thais is control. We have 5 minutes.
So it will be my closing remarks. So I'm super happy that we have managed to discuss. I have learned a lot about Brazilian foreign policy thinking on both the elite and public opinion side, but it's also lovely to discuss simply the link between public opinion and foreign policy. So I'm grateful for that discussion. And if you allow me just two, or if I manage three remarks. I totally get the point about Brazil enjoying a word of pragmatism and prudence. I wonder how can Brazil ensure it can still thrive in a world which apparently is becoming less prudent and less pragmatic. And for me, we can discuss the hypothesis of the US-China conflict, but in a way, if I bring as a joy killer that war in Ukraine as a case, it's also because for me it's a proof that the world has become less prudent, and it is putting also Brazil clearly in a difficult spot. So I understand, and Feliciano mentioned it when you visited us in Berlin, but it's also a common knowledge that one factor that is interfering in the Brazilian approach to Russia and Ukraine right now is the fact that you, as a country, economically have put yourself in a position where you depend quite substantially on fertilizers imported from Brazil, from Russia. That import is very is coming from the times when the world was pragmatic and it was a prudent decision in many ways. But currently, it is interfering with your choices, and it's just a case. And perhaps there will be, if the world changes the tack and becomes less prudent, then you would be increasingly put in such a difficult spot. You were wondering what's the number one foreign policy issue that matters for Brazilians, and I would guess that the number one issue would be whether the Brazilian president has been successful on the foreign policy front or not. Successful in the sense of his initiatives actually making difference. And I feel, but we'll discuss it over lunch. I feel that President Lula came back to power with a promise of bringing Brazil back to the international table, being active, and therefore his natural instinct was also to lead on the peace efforts in Ukraine, gather a coalition of countries that would jointly work on that solution. And apparently it has led nowhere. And currently there is a misunderstanding of what Brazil wants to do, how it sees its role in that war after having raised an interest of playing a role. Two very short comments. Your question of what is the number one foreign policy issue actually brings me to a discussion about that. Yeah, we can discuss whether foreign policy opinions are opinions or are they reactions. But even if they are opinions, even if people have clear opinions about some foreign policy matters, whether it's war in Gaza or Ukraine or China and the US, that still does not tell us to what extent those issues are salient in explaining their political choices, how they vote, whom they prefer, etc. I think that in Europe, we are at a moment where foreign policy, our research is attracting so much interest because people realize that foreign policy started being a salient issue. Right now, we are at a stage where there will be European elections in the EU. So elections to the European Parliament in each of the 27 member states. And foreign policy, especially related to war in Ukraine and European support for Ukraine, has become a salient issue, mobilizing some parties, demobilizing some other electorates, and thus also contributing to a shifting political balance in European countries. And a final point, I'm very curious to hear to see the research of your PhD student on how foreign policy opinions are getting formed. I agree that it might largely be a reflection of the debates that people are confronted with. But you mostly mentioned like the elites, the media that are forming this environment of a discussion. And perhaps where Brazil differs from Europe is that in Europe, another and perhaps a crucial interfering factor or contributing factor is disinformation by malicious actors, most probably Russia, but also others. And this is why it's governments in Europe, European bodies are putting a lot of attention to how the digital space is getting governed, because there is a feeling that it has become a very easy place to influence the opinions, which, as I said, also have become salient and have started having an impact on people's political choices. Again, thanks a lot for this conversation. Isabel?
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you, Professor Isabel. Thank you, the European Council on Foreign Relations, for the beginning of this partnership. And thank you, everyone, for being here. We received many questions from the audience. We won't be able to have 10 questions here, so I don't know how many people are online. So thank you again for everyone online. Obviously, it's a very interesting debate. And this is just to finalize. I was talking to Ivan again there was a very fruitful ride from the airport here. Is that we need to bring more. We need to make people aware of the data we have about Brazilians, how Brazilians think of foreign policy. When you talk to the foreign policy community in Brazil, diplomats, academics, they either don't know that Brazilians have a structured opinion, they don't know the results, and they don't have access to it. Because we come from an academia, so we are like very close among ourselves. We think about, we read the papers of each other. We need to make this more public. So one of the roles that we have here in this partnership is to make the data that we both have as CEBRI and the European Council on Foreign Relations on Brazil's opinion on foreign policy more clear and to the people out there. So CEBRI can have a very important role in make people know what Brazilians think, and having this data here over time. So every year we come with new data to update or to discuss issues like the war. Because tomorrow another war will come. Brazilians will form opinions on that war, and we will need to know what it's about. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And we'll see each other in the next seminar. Bye.